You step into the life of Gibran Khalil Gibran, born in 1883 in the Christian neighborhood of Bishari, the town perches high in the mountains, and its cliffs and forests will later echo through his poetry and art, giving his imagination its early scaffolding. You watch him as a child, walking barefoot on rough paths, sketching the craggy cliffs and distant horizons. Historians still argue whether his earliest inspirations came more from the natural landscapes around Bishari or from the stories whispered by his grandmother, who would weave folk tales and parables into the quiet evenings. You notice how even as a small boy, he seems to carry the weight of thoughtfulness, pausing mid-play to observe the world with an intensity far beyond his years. At home, the household hums with the tension of modest means and creative energy. His father, a schoolteacher and member of the Maronite community, tries to instill discipline, while his mother brings a gentleness that you sense will leave a permanent mark. Tragically, her presence is brief. Her death leaves a shadow in the household, a quiet ache that you can almost touch as you watch young Gibran wander the garden, collecting pebbles and leaves as if they might tell him secrets of the universe. Little known to most, he often carved miniature figurines from bits of wood and clay, a playful act of artistry that foreshadows the sculptures he will one day create. You accompany him through his first encounters with formal learning, noticing his rapid absorption of languages, Arabic at home, French in school. You sense that he delights in letters and sounds, in the cadence of words that will later shape his writing. His earliest poems, scribbled on scraps of paper, reveal a tender sensitivity that hints at future philosophical explorations. Even now, you feel the tension between the simplicity of a child's life and the depth of thought that pushes him beyond ordinary experience. Beirut, with its bustling markets, fragrant breezes, and intertwining cultures, is a living classroom, and you realize that every step Gibran takes here is quietly preparing him to become a bridge between worlds. As you drift along these streets with him, notice the subtle interplay of joy and melancholy. There is laughter in the marketplace, yet a quiet mourning in his eyes, a yearning for something he cannot yet name. Perhaps this duality, the light mingling with the shadow, is what gives his later work its distinctive resonance, its haunting ability to speak to the heart. You can almost feel the young Gibran pausing by the church bells, listening, imagining, and dreaming of a life that will one day carry his thoughts far beyond these streets. The city hums around him, full of stories, full of sense, full of the gentle pulse of human life, and he drinks it all in, storing it in memory, in sketches, in the small wooden carvings he hides beneath his bed. Even now, you can see the stirrings of rebellion and wonder in his gaze. He questions, silently, the strictures of his immediate world, the limitations of a small mountain town, and the boundaries set by tradition. He begins to understand, in ways a child rarely does, that his life might unfold not merely in Bishari or Beirut, but in the spaces between cultures, languages, and peoples. And as you walk with him through these narrow alleys and sunlit courtyards, you feel the seeds of a future that is quietly extraordinary, nurtured by early loss, tender observation, and a city that seems at once both ordinary and infinite. You follow Gibran as the rhythms of childhood shift into the first tremors of loss and longing. The warmth of his mother's presence, already fleeting in your memory, is replaced by a quiet emptiness that seems to stretch the walls of their home. You notice the boy tracing his fingers over the textures of the old wooden furniture, as if seeking comfort in what remains. It is 1885 when she dies, leaving Gibran only 2 years old. Yet the shadow of her absence lingers, shaping the tender, reflective person he is becoming. Later, when his father passes away after struggling with both financial hardship and ill health, you sense the finality of a childhood abruptly marked by grief. Historians still argue whether these early losses instilled in him an almost mystical sense of empathy or a relentless, searching melancholy that colors his later prose and poetry. Walking beside him, you see him navigating a household that suddenly feels vast and silent. Older siblings and relatives step in, trying to fill the void, yet it is clear that Gibran's inner world is where he retreats. He reads voraciously, a small lamp illuminating his eager eyes as he clutches borrowed books in Arabic and French. In these quiet hours he begins experimenting with words, scribbling his impressions of the sky, the mountains, and the fleeting faces of passers-by. A quirky detail emerges. Here he often writes on scraps of wall plaster, a habit that shows both his improvisational creativity and the scarcity of paper in their modest home. You watch and understand that each mark he leaves is an attempt to anchor his thoughts, to make sense of absence, of longing, of the small, trembling mysteries of life. You sense that even in grief, there is a subtle rebellion in Gibran. He questions the order of the world, the seeming indifference of fate, and the limitations imposed by his small surroundings. He starts observing the natural rhythms around him, the turning of seasons, the rustle of leaves, the ebb and flow of villagers' lives. He becomes fascinated with the stories of saints and hermits from the mountains, absorbing the spiritual and the mystical in ways that later scholars will note as foundational to his philosophy. These early contemplations, gentle and almost imperceptible, quietly fortify him against the waves of sadness that ripple through his young life. Evenings bring you to the bustling streets again, yet Gibran walks differently now. He notices the sorrow hidden in everyday smiles, the quiet endurance in laborers' hands, and the fleeting joy of children playing in sunlit courtyards. Historians still debate how much these early observations of human struggle and resilience inform the compassionate universality of the prophet decades later. You watch him absorb it all, storing glimpses of life that later become allegories, parables, and metaphors in his writing. And yet, amidst grief, there is also tenderness. He forms small, secret connections with family, friends, neighbors, and even animals wandering the village paths. Little known to many, he often gave scraps of food to stray cats and dogs, noticing their silent, uncomplaining dignity. These moments are tiny, almost imperceptible threads that, when woven together, create the tapestry of empathy and insight that will define his work. You realize that loss, while piercing, also sharpens perception, teaching him the subtle music of human emotion. As you walk with him through this delicate terrain of absence and reflection, you notice his growing inclination toward introspection. He listens more than he speaks, observes more than he interrupts, and begins to understand the unseen rhythms that govern hearts, communities, and the natural world. You feel the quiet intensity of a boy learning to navigate not only the world around him but the inner world of longing and remembrance. It is in these tender, shadowed moments that Gibran's imagination begins to ferment, a gentle alchemy of grief and wonder, forging the sensitivity and philosophical depth that will later echo through every page he writes. You step aboard the creaking deck of a ship bound for Boston, the salty wind whipping through your hair as the coastline of Lebanon shrinks behind you. The year is 1895, and Gibran is 12, carrying a small suitcase, a heart full of curiosity, and the invisible weight of both excitement and trepidation. You feel the thrumming energy of the ocean beneath your feet, the creak of wood, and the smell of tar mixed with sea spray. Boston promises a strange new world, cobblestone streets, horse-drawn carriages, and a melting pot of immigrants, each with their own accents and stories. You'd probably feel both overwhelmed and exhilarated in such a place. Yet Gibran seems to adapt with a quiet resilience. Historians still argue whether his early exposure to this Western urban environment shaped his later writing more than the mountain villages of Bashari. But you can already see the duality taking root, the tension between East and West in his young mind. You walk beside him through the crowded streets of Boston, absorbing the smells of bakeries, the chatter of neighbors, and the occasional church bell tolling above. He lives with relatives who are eager to provide guidance, yet unable to fully comprehend the depth of his imaginative world. At school, he struggles with English at first, his accent thick, his handwriting hesitant, but he is determined. You notice him sketching the skyline and street scenes on scraps of paper, capturing the rhythm of this bustling city with the same quiet intensity that defined his Lebanese sketches. Little known to many, he even doodled caricatures of his teachers, sometimes slipping in subtle jokes, a playful defiance that hints at his later satirical edge. Life in Boston also brings small doses of social wonder. You walk with him along the Common, watching ice skaters and street performers, noting the stark contrast between the freedom of movement here and the structured traditions of his homeland. These observations will later appear subtly in his poetry, the careful mapping of human expression and urban interaction. He is fascinated by the variety of people, their clothing, their gestures, their music, all of which seem to pulse with a foreign rhythm he both admires and questions. You sense a boy bridging worlds, already cultivating the empathy and cosmopolitan understanding that will infuse his later works. Mentorship appears unexpectedly. He studies under local artists and teachers who recognize his talent and encourage both his painting and literary experiments. You linger in the small sunlit studios where he practices drawing with charcoal and ink, trying to capture shadows, faces, and fleeting moments of life. Historians still debate how much of this early Boston art training contributed to the mystical symbolism in his later paintings, but the seeds are clearly visible: the attention to form, the sense of movement, and the yearning for expression that transcends ordinary perception. You notice moments of homesickness. At night, he stares at the moon, recalling the cedar forests of Bushari, the scent of spices in his mother's kitchen, and the playful laughter of siblings. This longing quietly fuels his writing, giving rise to early poems in Arabic that speak of exile, belonging, and memory. His dual-language existence, navigating Arabic at home, English at school, creates a unique tension, a stretching of thought and feeling across linguistic borders. It is an early rehearsal for the bridges he will later construct between cultures, philosophies, and readers. Amidst adaptation, there are also fleeting joys. You walk with him to small art galleries and libraries, marveling at the paintings, engravings, and rare books he encounters. A quirky anecdote emerges here. He once attempted to translate the visual drama of a Shakespeare play into a charcoal sketch, blending theater and art in a way that surprises even his mentors. These small experiments hint at the interdisciplinary mind of a young polymath, one who will later fuse words, drawings, and spiritual insights into singular works that resonate across generations. Boston hums with possibilities, a place both strange and welcoming, and as you follow Gibran through crowded classrooms, quiet libraries, and sunlit studios, you realize that the dual pull of memory and imagination shapes each step he takes. Every alleyway and classroom, every brushstroke and scribbled word, begins to forge a path that carries him toward an extraordinary synthesis of East and West, of observation and insight, of longing and belonging. You feel the first true expansion of his world beyond Bishari, a stepping stone to a life that will ripple across oceans and decades quietly, preparing him to become the voice we now know, the one who will speak for both the heart and the soul. You step into the quiet sunlit studios of Boston and later New York, following Gibran as he begins to discover the vast possibilities of artistic expression. The scent of turpentine, wet paint, and pressed paper hangs in the air, blending with the faint aroma of ink and old books. You watch him as he leans over his sketches, charcoal smudging his fingers, capturing both the curve of a hand and the intangible weight of a thought. In these moments you sense that art is not merely a pastime for him but a way of probing existence itself. Historians still debate whether his early visual art or his literary endeavors first shaped his distinctive voice, but it is clear that both were inseparable, feeding each other like twin rivers converging. Walking through the studios, you notice the mentors who recognize his talent. One eccentric teacher insists that every artist must paint blindfolded at least once, to truly feel the soul of the brush, and Gibran takes this challenge with a quiet enthusiasm. It produces unexpected, almost dreamlike compositions that hint at the spiritual abstraction for which he will later be known. Little known to many, he was also captivated by the decorative arts of the Boston Public Library, spending hours sketching the carved columns, ornate arches, and patterned tiles, absorbing details that would subtly appear in his paintings and literary metaphors. You sense the boy now growing into a young man, beginning to merge technical skill with imagination and instinct with philosophy. His artistic awakening is intertwined with social experiences. You accompany him to small gatherings of fellow students and immigrants, where sketches are exchanged like secrets, ideas debated in hushed tones, and laughter punctuates the clatter of coffee cups. He experiments with self-portraiture, trying to capture not only the image of his own face, but the reflection of an inner world shaped by both longing and observation. There is a playful quirk here. He once drew a series of whimsical sketches of his instructors as mythological figures, a subtle rebellion that hints at his later willingness to challenge norms, while remaining deeply respectful of tradition. You also sense the evolution of his spiritual and philosophical vision in tandem with his art. Gibran becomes fascinated with mystical texts and allegorical illustrations, studying both Western religious symbolism and the esoteric motifs of the Middle East. He blends these influences in his sketches, sometimes creating fantastical scenes of wandering prophets, solitary monks, or trees with human-like expressions. Historians still argue whether his symbolic imagery was more influenced by European romanticism or by the folk spirituality of Lebanon. Yet it is evident that he is building a visual vocabulary that mirrors his literary sensibilities. There are private rituals you observe as well. He often paints at dawn when the air is crisp and the city's noise has not yet begun. Birds perch outside his window, occasionally pecking at the sill, as if curious about the gentle movements of his brush. He talks to himself softly, naming the shapes and assigning them meanings, creating a dialogue between mind, hand, and canvas. It is in these quiet, intimate moments that he develops the contemplative patience that will later permeate his writing. The interplay between observation and imagination deepens. You watch him sketch strangers on street corners, not merely copying their forms but attempting to capture an essence, a fleeting emotion, a fragment of a soul passing by. These studies teach him empathy, subtlety, and the importance of seeing beyond the obvious, skills that will eventually infuse the spiritual depth of his prose. You feel the thrill of watching a young artist learning to balance technical skill, emotional insight, and philosophical reflection. Each stroke a meditation, each line a bridge between the seen and the unseen. And as you drift with him through the silent studios, you begin to sense a rhythm to his days. Early morning sketches, afternoons of study and reading, evenings filled with conversation and gentle debate. Boston and New York are no longer just cities. They are laboratories for a mind both sensitive and restless, a place where he tests the boundaries of form, perspective, and meaning. You realize that this period of artistic awakening is not simply a preparation for later fame. It is the crucible in which Gibran refines his understanding of humanity, spirit, and expression, quietly forging the tools he will later wield to touch countless hearts across the world. You hover over Gibran's shoulder as he begins to navigate the delicate art of words, feeling the soft weight of a pencil in his hand, the roughness of paper beneath his fingers. The early 1900s hum with possibility, and you notice how he experiments, sometimes in Arabic, sometimes in English, capturing fleeting impressions, emotions, and philosophical reflections. His first publications arrive cautiously, tentative essays and poems in local periodicals that reveal a mind both searching and precise. Historians still argue whether his initial success came more from his stylistic innovation or from the novelty of his cultural perspective, but what is undeniable is the quiet courage it takes to send your innermost thoughts into the world. You observe the careful rhythm of his writing life. He sketches first, translating visual ideas into words, a fluid interchange between art and literature that becomes his signature. In one whimsical moment, he even writes a poem inspired by a street cat, giving it human-like qualities and philosophical musings, a little-known tidbit that illustrates his playful curiosity. You sense that these small acts of imagination are the rehearsal for the universal themes he will later explore: love, loss, exile, and the quest for understanding. Each line he writes is a gentle probe into existence, a tender invitation for readers to see beyond the ordinary. Boston and New York provide both challenge and inspiration. He encounters literary circles, attends lectures, and engages in debates about modernism, symbolism, and spirituality. You feel the thrill as he hesitates before submitting a story, questioning whether his voice belongs in this bustling literary world. There is a light-hearted anecdote here. Once, after a particularly critical workshop, he quietly drew a caricature of the lecturer holding a giant quill and a scroll of incomprehensible hieroglyphs, sharing it only with close friends. These playful interventions reveal his growing confidence, his willingness to challenge authority, and his subtle sense of humor. The tension between Arabic and English writing is palpable. You witness Gibran crafting a poem in Arabic, pausing to consider how certain phrases might resonate differently in English. This duality forms the bridge between his heritage and his adopted world, an intricate dance of syntax and sensibility. Historians still debate whether he felt more liberated expressing mystical ideas in Arabic or philosophical ones in English. Yet it is clear that both languages allow him to explore dimensions of thought the other cannot fully capture. You notice his growing circle of correspondents and friends, each offering critiques, encouragement, and sometimes sharp disagreement. These interactions sharpen his literary skills, teaching him the subtlety of persuasion, the resonance of rhythm, and the weight of metaphor. Quietly, he begins to develop recurring motifs: nature as mirror, exile as metaphor, the blending of human and divine, that will later define his distinctive voice. Little known to most, he also experimented with prose that combined story and essay, philosophy and parable, foreshadowing the hybrid form of the prophet. Amidst the intellectual rigor, he retains moments of reflection and solitude. He strolls along rivers, sketches trees and pedestrians, and allows his mind to drift into dreamlike territories. The faint aroma of ink and paint lingers in his small study, the sound of distant streetcars and murmured conversation creating a gentle soundtrack. You feel the careful cultivation of patience here, the slow, deliberate practice that transforms observation into insight, experience into narrative, thought into art. By the time he produces his early volumes, you can sense a quiet mastery, a seamless weaving of imagery, philosophy, and emotion. He experiments with structure, letting the poem meander like a stream, letting the essay unfold like a dialogue between past and present. These early literary steps are not flashy or bombastic. They are meticulous, meditative, and imbued with empathy. Watching him, you understand that every poem, every essay, every line of prose is a step toward the delicate balance between vision and expression, the foundation of a voice that will eventually speak to millions across continents. You walk alongside Gibran as he arrives in Paris, the city of light, art, and restless creativity. The Seine glimmers under a soft, late-afternoon sun, and the streets are alive with chatter, accordion music, and the scent of freshly baked baguettes, mingling with smoke from distant. You'd probably feel both enchanted and disoriented, caught between the grandeur of the Louvre, the eccentricity of Montmartre, and the sheer energy of artists hustling their sketches to tourists. For Gibran, this city is both playground and proving ground. Historians still argue whether his Paris years were more influential for his visual artistry or for the philosophical depth of his writing. Yet the convergence of both is undeniable in this period. You watch him navigating the ateliers and salons, where painters, sculptors, and writers debate endlessly about symbolism, impressionism, and modernism. He listens, sketches, and absorbs, translating each conversation into private reflections that will later echo through his essays. There is a playful quirk here. Gibran once painted a self-portrait with exaggerated features as a joke for a mentor, yet beneath the humor lies an emerging mastery of expression, a subtle sophistication in capturing both form and essence. He studies anatomy, perspective, and the human form in a way that suggests almost meditative attention, and you feel the quiet rigor of his artistic discipline. Paris introduces him to cultural diversity on an unprecedented scale, teamed with artists from Italy, Spain, Russia, and beyond. He observes gestures, studies facial expressions, and sketches fleeting interactions between strangers. This cosmopolitan immersion nurtures his understanding of human universals, the gestures, dreams, and fears shared across borders. Little known to many, he also collects discarded postcards, scraps of decorative paper, and odd trinkets, later incorporating these tactile inspirations into collage-like sketches that reveal a fascination with texture and memory. You sense the tension between tradition and innovation as he absorbs European influences while remaining deeply rooted in Lebanese culture. He studies classical sculptures, marvels at Renaissance masterpieces, and yet constantly returns in thought to cedar forests and mountain villages. Historians still debate whether this tension between East and West defines his symbolic style more than his personal spiritual quest, but it is evident that Paris refines the lens through which he sees the world. Every brushstroke, every sketch, every casual note scribbled in margins carries the imprint of a mind learning to navigate complexity with clarity. In the quiet corners of his rented studio, he experiments with narrative illustration, blending sketches and short essays in ways that surprise even himself. He often pauses to stare at the moonlight filtering through the windows, remembering the mountains of Beirut and sensing connections between distant landscapes and human emotion. There is an almost imperceptible dialogue forming between his inner life and the external world, a conversation that will later become central to his philosophical writings. Evenings are spent in salons or walking along the Seine, observing human interactions and participating in gentle debates about spirituality, morality, and art. These conversations, while sometimes playful, are deeply formative, refining his capacity to articulate profound ideas with simplicity and grace. You feel him absorbing not just techniques, but ways of seeing, sensing, and reflecting that will underpin both his literary and visual work. As you drift with him through the streets of Paris, you begin to understand how these years shape the convergence of artistry and philosophy. The city hums with inspiration, pushing him toward refinement, experimentation, and a subtle mastery of form and thought. Every encounter, every sketch, every reflective pause lays another stone in the bridge between imagination and expression, preparing him for the works that will eventually resonate across continents and generations. You accompany Gibran back to the hills and villages of Lebanon, where the familiar scent of cedar and wild thyme greets you like an old friend. Returning from Paris and Boston, you feel the contrast sharply. Narrow cobblestone lanes, warm earths underfoot, and the hum of daily village life instead of the bustling of foreign cities. This homecoming is layered with nostalgia, a gentle ache, and an awakening awareness of roots, culture, and identity. You watch Gibran walking among his people, noting their gestures, expressions, and routines, as if cataloging them for future stories. Historians still debate whether his return deepened his literary perspective more than his earlier travels, but you can see how the landscapes and faces of Lebanon embed themselves into his mind and imagination. You wander with him through familiar churches and monastery courtyards, listening to the faint chimes echoing across the valleys. Here, he reconnects with spiritual life, absorbing both Maronite rituals and folk tales passed down by elders, weaving these elements into his expanding literary and artistic vocabulary. There is a quiet humor in the way he sometimes mimics villagers' exaggerated storytelling gestures when alone, sketching them in small notebooks for private amusement. A little-known tidbit that illustrates his playful yet perceptive nature. You sense that these observations are not mere imitation but careful study, shaping the characters' parables and allegories that will later emerge in his writing. Political consciousness also surfaces. Conversations with local intellectuals and teachers reveal a region struggling with foreign rule, cultural preservation, and modernist ideas. You sense the stirring of a voice attuned to both justice and human compassion. Gibran's lectures and essays during this time begin to explore these themes delicately, balancing advocacy with poetry. Even simple encounters, a tradesman bargaining at the market, a student reciting a poem, spark reflections on society, power, and the subtle ways communities sustain themselves. Historians still argue whether his political awareness or spiritual sensibility was more influential in shaping his worldview, yet here both converge seamlessly. You notice the quieter, personal moments that make up the rhythm of daily life. He often retreats to the forests and cliffs near Beirut, sketching trees, birds, and the patterns of sunlight on stone. These solitary excursions allow him to meditate on existence and human connection, and they foster the reflective calm that permeates his essays and poetry. Little known to many, he occasionally carved tiny wooden figurines inspired by village children at play, merging observation, artistry, and empathy in private acts of creation. Evenings bring gentle gatherings with family and neighbors, where storytelling flows naturally. You feel the warmth of these interactions, the soft laughter, the shared wisdom, and the lingering mysteries of history discussed in hushed tones. Gibran absorbs everything. The cadence of voices, the texture of conversations, the tender silences. Each sensory impression becomes a brushstroke, each anecdote a thread woven into the tapestry of his literary imagination. As you drift with him along familiar paths and hillsides, you feel the gentle tension between memory and experience. Nostalgia blends with observation, tradition with curiosity, and personal reflection with social awareness. You sense how deeply this reconnection with homeland, culture, and people will nourish his work, infusing it with authenticity, empathy, and enduring philosophical depth. Here, amid the mountains and streets of his youth, Gibran hones a vision that bridges past and present, east and west, reality and imagination, preparing him for the literary heights that will soon define his career. You settle beside Gibran as he begins to shape the work that will eventually become The Prophet, feeling the quiet intensity of a mind fully immersed in both observation and meditation. The streets of Boston and New York hum faintly beyond his windows, but within there is only the soft scratch of pencil on paper, the gentle rhythm of thought translating into words. You'd probably find the process slow, almost hypnotic, but for him it is both necessity and joy, a way of distilling life into language that feels timeless. Historians still argue whether his vision of universal truth in The Prophet drew more from mystical Christian traditions, Islamic Sufism, or his own reflections on human experience. Yet you can sense a synthesis forming that transcends simple categorization. You watch him refine each chapter, often pacing the small room between writing bouts, muttering phrases under his breath, rearranging sentences like musical notes. There is a little-known quirk here. He sometimes read his lines aloud to a small collection of houseplants, claiming that the words absorbed by living things felt truer than those read in isolation. You feel the subtle layering of intention and inspiration in every paragraph, the blending of allegory, parable, and poetic cadence that will become the hallmark of the text. Each chapter emerges like a ripple on water, delicate yet profound, inviting readers to pause, reflect, and perhaps see their own lives mirrored. The book's themes crystallize around love, friendship, work, joy, sorrow, and death. You sense Gibran's deep empathy in every sentence. It is almost tactile, the way he captures longing, fulfillment, and the quiet interweaving of human experience. He often pauses to glance at sketches of human forms or symbols on his desk, translating visual insight into literary metaphor. This interplay between word and image is subtle yet unmistakable, demonstrating a harmony of senses that few artists achieve. Historians still debate the extent to which his Middle Eastern heritage influenced the universal appeal of these parables, but it is clear that the blend of personal experience, spiritual reflection, and literary craft is what gives the work its enduring resonance. You accompany him as he tests passages with close friends and fellow intellectuals, gauging reactions while remaining quietly protective of the work's integrity. There is a gentle tension here, the desire for recognition balanced against the fear of misinterpretation. You notice how even the smallest edits, a shift of a word or phrase, can alter the rhythm of a paragraph, reflecting the meticulous attention that defines his approach. Little known to many, he sometimes inserted subtle visual symbols in margins, sketches that resonate with the themes of each chapter, a nod to his integrated artistic sensibility. Publication brings a quiet triumph. The Prophet is received with both enthusiasm and debate, capturing attention across continents. You sense the initial awe, the gentle ripple of influence as readers encounter these reflections on life, love, and spirituality. Its success is not instantaneous fame, but rather a slow recognition, a growing reverence, that continues to this day. And as you linger in the gentle glow of Gibran's study, you understand how years of observation, travel, loss, and introspection converge in these pages, producing a work both simple and profound, intimate and universal. You can feel the quiet joy of creation in Gibran's movements, the soft satisfaction of a task realized. Each chapter is a meditation, each line a bridge between the visible world and the ineffable. The Prophet emerges not merely as a book but as a manifestation of a life lived with deep awareness, careful reflection, and an unwavering desire to connect the human heart to the eternal. You sense that this is only one of the many legacies he leaves behind, but perhaps the most enduring, a gentle companion to anyone willing to sit quietly and listen to the whispers of the human soul. You linger in the quietest spaces of Gibran's life, moving through the rooms where friendships, correspondences, and small secrets shape the rhythms of his days. You sense the warmth of those who enter his world, fellow artists, writers, and thinkers, yet also the weight of solitude that he carries. Gibran's relationships are layered, tender, and occasionally enigmatic, and you can feel the gentle push and pull of intimacy and distance. Historians still debate the precise nature of some of these friendships, the influence they had on his writing, and the unspoken tensions that occasionally shaped his perspective. But the human warmth is palpable even now. You follow him to gatherings filled with conversation, laughter, and occasional spirited debate. In one little-known anecdote, he once hosted a late-night reading where a candle flickered precariously and a curious cat leapt onto his papers, scattering sketches and notes. Instead of frustration, he laughed, rearranging the materials with a calm patience that seems almost otherworldly. These small, whimsical moments reveal a sensitivity and flexibility of mind that underpin both his artistic and literary work. You notice the way he engages with ideas, absorbing, reflecting, and translating them into creative expression that transcends simple observation. The intimacy of his circle extends to personal mentors and protégés. You see him offering guidance with quiet authority, listening as much as he speaks, encouraging creativity, and nurturing the ambitions of those around him. There is a gentle reciprocity here. Friendships feed his insight even as he supports others, creating a network of minds and hearts quietly resonating with mutual respect. Historians still argue over the depth of influence certain companions had on his philosophical development, yet the consistent thread is Gibran's capacity for empathy and his fascination with the inner lives of others. You also sense the quiet mysteries of his life, moments that are not fully recorded or explained. Private letters, sketchbooks, and essays hint at dreams, regrets, and reflections that remain partly hidden. Little known to many, he maintained a habit of writing in the margins of books he borrowed, noting fleeting thoughts that would sometimes resurface in later works. These small annotations are glimpses of a mind constantly in dialogue with itself, weaving personal insight with universal reflection. Even in social contexts, Gibran exhibits a subtle performative awareness, a careful calibration of presence and absence. You see him seated quietly in salons, nodding thoughtfully, allowing others to speak, yet every observation is catalogued, every gesture internalized. This reflective attentiveness becomes the lens through which he interprets humanity. Both in personal interactions and in his literary and artistic endeavors, you can feel the echoes of this approach in The Prophet, where careful observation and empathetic insight shape every sentence and parable. Amidst these friendships and mysteries, you notice moments of private joy and playfulness. He sketches caricatures, composes playful aphorisms, and occasionally teases friends with gentle wit. These gestures reveal not only charm, but also the subtle ways he negotiates social bonds, maintaining individuality while fostering connection. They are quiet acts of intimacy, small gestures that reveal the depth of his attentiveness and care. As you drift with him through these intricate webs of human connection, you sense the delicate interplay of presence and reflection, intimacy and solitude. Every relationship, anecdote, and private observation is a thread in the fabric of his life, weaving together the complexity, curiosity, and empathy that define both the man and his work. And in these quiet spaces you realize that Gibran's ability to touch hearts arises not only from his words and images, but from the authenticity, sensitivity, and attentiveness cultivated over a lifetime of observing, listening, and quietly participating in the lives of others. You walk alongside Gibran through the bustling streets of New York in the 1930s, feeling the hum of the city beneath your feet. The clatter of streetcars, the chatter of pedestrians, the distant wail of a saxophone drifting from a corner cafe. The weight of years rests lightly on his shoulders, his hair streaked with gray, his hands lined with both labor and artistry. You sense a reflective calm in him now, a gentle acceptance of life's impermanence alongside an abiding curiosity about the world. Historians still debate whether his final years were more consumed by literary revision, spiritual exploration, or personal contemplation. Yet all these threads weave seamlessly into the fabric of a life fully lived. You notice the daily rhythms of his life. Mornings spent drafting letters to correspondents around the globe, afternoons in quiet study, evenings attended by friends or lecturers, or simply solitary walks where he observes life unfolding around him. There is a whimsical quirk in these routines. He occasionally paused to sketch strangers on the street, capturing a fleeting expression or posture, a practice that had begun decades earlier but never waned. These small acts are more than habit. They are his way of recording humanity, of seeing the divine in ordinary moments, of honoring the intricate choreography of life that most passers-by overlook. The legacy of his work surrounds him, quietly acknowledged in letters, conversations, and the growing presence of his books in homes, libraries, and schools. You feel the satisfaction, tempered by humility, as he senses the gentle ripple of influence spreading across continents. Yet, alongside recognition, there are lingering mysteries and unanswered questions. Scholarly debates over the exact sources of his philosophical ideas, the subtleties of his personal relationships, and the hidden inspirations behind particular passages. You sense that Gibran himself might have smiled at such debates, aware that the interpretation of art and thought is as dynamic as life itself. His friendships and collaborations remain tender and complex. You watch him interacting with younger writers and artists, offering guidance, encouragement, and subtle critique. There is a quiet generosity in these interactions, a patient cultivation of creativity and reflection. Little known to many, he often gifted sketches or handwritten aphorisms to friends, small treasures that carried not only artistry but a philosophy of shared human experience. You feel the resonance of this generosity, the way it amplifies his influence beyond words on a page. Even as age deepens, his curiosity and empathy remain undiminished. He observes the city's diversity, the gestures, expressions, and interactions of its people, with the same intensity that defined his youth. You sense how this continuous attention to the world fuels both his art and his prose, keeping him connected to life in its ordinary and extraordinary moments alike. These final years are less about production and more about reflection, a gentle weaving together of a lifetime of observations, experiences, and insights. You follow him through quiet streets at dusk, the sky a muted palette of gold and lavender, as he walks with deliberate steps. There is a serenity in his gait, a softness in his gaze, a gentle acceptance of the passage of time. You feel the culmination of decades of travel, loss, study, and creation coalescing into a calm wisdom, a presence that quietly invites others to contemplate life, love, and the eternal. In his final reflections, every sketch, every line of poetry, every parable stands as a testament to a life devoted to understanding and illuminating the human spirit. And as you linger beside him, absorbing the gentle rhythms of these last years, you sense the enduring echo of his voice, the subtle light of his presence in the world, and the quiet reverberation of his insights across time and space. Gibran's footsteps may one day grow silent, but the paths he charted with ink, brush, and thought continue to guide, inspire, and console, leaving a legacy that is at once intimate, universal, and timeless. The day draws softly to a close, and you feel the gentle quiet of reflection settling around you. Gibran's life stretches behind you like a delicate tapestry, threaded with longing, creativity, observation, and empathy. The mountains of Bishari, the streets of Boston and New York, the salons of Paris, all converge in a single, luminous current, shaping a mind that touched both heart and spirit. You imagine him walking alone beneath a canopy of stars, the soft rustle of leaves accompanying his thoughts, each step a meditation on love, loss, and the enduring beauty of the human soul. You sense the patience and persistence that guided him through grief, artistic challenge, and the uncertainties of life, the gentle interplay of solitude and connection that informed his work. Each painting, each essay, each parable was born from both observation and introspection, a delicate balance of seeing and feeling, knowing and wondering. As you reflect on his journey, you feel a calm understanding of how ordinary experiences, shared laughter, fleeting glances, whispered stories, can ripple outward, becoming profound insights that resonate across generations. The soft rhythms of memory and imagination mingle in your mind, creating a gentle landscape where mountains, cities, sketches, and words coexist in quiet harmony. You can almost hear the faint echo of his voice, the cadence of phrases that invite reflection, the quiet warmth that moves beneath the surface of every work. The legacy of Gibran Khalil Gibran is not only in what he wrote or painted, but in the tender, attentive way he approached life, seeing divinity in ordinary moments and compassion in every encounter. As you settle into this calm, let the world grow still around you. Feel the quiet assurance that a life lived with curiosity, empathy, and creativity leaves gentle traces that linger long after footsteps fade. The mountains, the cities, the friends, the fleeting moments, they all converge into a soft, enduring light. You exhale slowly, letting the peace of reflection and the resonance of his life settle within you, and drift gently toward rest, carried by the subtle hum of memory, imagination, and quiet inspiration.